Welcome to the Land Cruiser Project. In this video I'm going to cover some of the pitfalls and some of the lessons that I've learned from installing one of the best lockers for the 100 Series Land Cruiser. So here we are. We are 2 weeks into installing a rear locker onto the 100 Series. I kind of teased it in my last video, but I ended up going down to Japanese Auto Parts in LEHI and spending a good chunk of a day there pulling a locked third member, right? So the differential out of one of the Land Cruisers he had there, one of the 100 Series, as well as the passenger axle shaft out of there. It went reasonably well. Didn't really have any hiccups. And kind of paired with that, at the same time, I went through and ordered just kind of a handful of different parts. There's a really good thread on I Hate Mud that I'll link below that covers a lot of the basics. And yeah, so what I want to cover today is just going through some of the pitfalls and some of the lessons learned that I've gone through about doing this project. And let me start off by saying, like, this is not a project that most will take on. So I think even time and money-wise, you might be better off doing, you know, an ARB or a hair up or something else, because this has taken a lot of effort. It's been pretty challenging. You know, there's a lot to it. There's, you know, things that you need to buy in order to do this, or, you know, get it, you know, farmed out. You know, there's tools that you need to buy. So we'll go over some of these things and what their purpose is and why, you know, why they've been helpful, why they're needed. And anyway, all right, so let's talk about why I needed a press for this job. So I pulled from the donor vehicle, I pulled the third member, right, the differential, you know, along with the locker and all of the wiring that I could get. I also pulled the passenger side axle shaft. And now the reason you do that, and it's pretty obvious when you look at these, but there is a significant difference in the length of splines on this is the locked axle, this is the unlocked axle. So there's far more engagement on the locked axle, and that allows the differential locker to go, you know, kind of up and down on it. So you could get away with just pulling your unlocked axle and throwing in your other one. I couldn't do that, and I ended up getting all new retainers, new tone ring. Okay, so talking about all the parts that I replaced in order to, you know, kind of make this as good as possible. One thing I wanted, the reason I did this, first of all, was not only having peace of mind of some new parts, but my hub was in slightly better shape, you know, a little bit less rusty. And, you know, I knew the history on the brakes and all those things. So working our way from the outboard up, these are the different things that were replaced here. So new wheel studs, a new paper gasket in between this oil deflector and the flange of the axle itself. Up in there, you're not going to be able to see it, but up in there, there is a, let's see, it's a gasket. It's kind of a pain in the butt, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. I'll get this axle flipped up the other way. So moving up here to the inboard side of the axle, you've got a wheel bearing that's right here. This is, again, the inboard side of it. There's a little washer that's resting in between this, and this is what's referred to as like the, you know, the outer retainer. On top of this, there's a C-clip that holds all this in and keeps the wheel bearing from coming out. Now there's a little bit of a gap. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. This is the ABS tone ring. You know, all this is just one piece from down here all the way up there, and then there's another retainer. So this is the retainer that the axle sill, inner axle sill, rides against. And if we switch to my old one, you can see, you know, that groove, right? And it's not much of a groove in this case. It's actually just, you know, kind of polished. And there's a little bit of focus. Anyway, so you can see right where that sill rides, and it's, you know, right in the middle, and it just makes a little, you know, kind of smooth polish spot there on that ring. So you certainly don't need to go through all the effort I went through to swap the hub over and put new, you know, kind of consumable parts on here. You could just, you know, throw it in there. But again, because I didn't know what the history was of the vehicle I got the, you know, both the axle and the differential from, I went through a little bit extra expense to do that. And all of the, you know, the stuff on the axle is all pretty inexpensive. I think, you know, my first order for all that stuff, you know, came to something around, you know, like 90 bucks. So it's not terrible. You know, what really drove the cost was about 500 bucks for the differential itself, and then is approximately 400 or so for, you know, the rebuild, both parts and the labor on it. So one piece of equipment that you're going to need to be able to do this job is a press. So I picked this up from Harbor Freight. It's the 20-ton. It's $200, and I picked it up knowing that I'd resell it and likely have a friend that'll take it off my hands. But I want to talk about two things that made this a little bit easier for me to manage on my own. I didn't always have help on this. So the first one is, because I'm not, I don't have anybody helping me when it comes time to raise this up and lower it. You need to kind of sometimes load the parts and then raise it up or lower it in order to do the press work. So having something, and I found that this little funnel worked out really well. Because I end up kind of raising the what do you call it, the deck here, kind of one layer at a time and kind of scissor it up. And so having something there so that, whatever you're pressing doesn't, slide out of like the jaws that you've got here or up against the frame, that was really helpful. And then the other thing is just kind of down here, normally the axle shaft's going to be poking down here, when you're pressing things in, but having just a little piece of aluminum, on a blanket so it stays there. So that way it's, not getting caught in the blanket, but also this little piece down here, it's actually kind of like an angle iron, but up at an angle. So it just kind of gives a little stability when you're loading the part. So with all that being said, yeah, the press worked out really well. It had enough strength for what I was doing, and there's a particular tool that we'll cover here in a second that is designed to work really well with this, and so yeah, I want to show that off. I'll link it in the description. But there's a gentleman on eBay, great customer service, great response times, and makes a decent product here. Anyway, his name's Dwayne, and this is the kit for the 100 Series Land Cruiser. I think he's including this little, kind of collar thing now, but really what you see right here in front of you, so the this piece, this one, the plate, the little kind of washer looking thing, and then the main kind of press tool, they're kind of, I think, simulating this, the service tools, the Toyota tools, but different combinations of them do different things. Whether you're pulling off, this is essentially a gear splitter, so this is pulling off the ABS tone ring off the axle. This plate is used for when you're pressing stuff back onto the axle. This washer helps drive the wheel bearing and some of the other retainers in, and then this is a piece that interacts with the hub assembly in order to separate the hub from the axle itself. But just very well made. So I had a couple issues that I caused on my own, and Dwayne was very responsive. One example would be the wheel bearing, the inner race. I know it's not going to be worth showing, but separated, and and so I needed a different pry tool, and I've mucked this one up due to another issue I had. But anyway, imagine it's looking a little bit better. But this slides in underneath that race and pries it off. So he sent all that stuff up for very, very reasonable prices, and yeah, very, very pleased with my interactions with Dwayne, and highly recommend if you've got to do this job, check out his tool, but also check out that Timmy the Toolman video. That's very, very helpful. All right, so we've already talked about some of the lessons that I learned with the press, as well as some of the tips. But let's move on to the axle shaft and some of the things that I learned and some tips on getting that swapped over. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is the sill that is tucked up in there between the axle and the housing itself. That's really not going to show, but what I do want to illustrate is, this is the sill. This is one of the used ones, and this actually goes up and in to the this camera. I swear, it is so terrible. What is it even focusing on? Are you too close? What's the deal? Anyway, so this is the sill. It goes up into the hub, and it's actually the second step that you do in preparing your axle and your hub assembly before you put it all together. So the first one is just getting the wheel bearing in there, and then you put this on the outer hub, and then at that point you start stacking some of the stuff on top, principally the washer and that the outer retainer. Anyway, so when you do that, you need to be really ginger, and I think before I had that little oil dill kind of keeping this assembly straight in the press as I would kind of walk it back and forth and up, it caused this to get dislodged, and when it does that, it actually kind of falls in underneath the oil deflector here, and it's like impossible to get out. I ended up having to use a little right angle pick and kind of picked it out. It wasn't sharp, but was able to kind of walk it out and get it out so it was resting there. That needs to be in the right place because that keeps external water and dirt and sand and all that from getting to that wheel bearing. And so if that's not in place, the longevity of your wheel bearing is going to be quite a bit less. Another thing that's worth mentioning here is when you're pressing on these two pieces, you put them on together. So this is the inner retainer and this is the ABS tone ring. As you push those down onto the axle shaft, I measured the distance here before I took it off is somewhere between 10 and 11 millimeters. Now it's not totally critical that you get that measurement because you can do something that's a Sharpie test. You mark a Sharpie here, you insert it, and the oil seal will rub against this here and kind of blur out the Sharpie, and so you can tell exactly where the sill is riding, and as long as it's in the middle here, that's really not a problem. So one of the issues I had was that I wasn't paying attention. It's kind of funny, on the back of this ABS tone ring, you can maybe see it on this one here, there's a little bit of like an angle, and that actually matches, there's a diameter change that you can't see just right underneath here. And so I thought mistakenly that you would push this, that those would match up, right? That you would push this tone ring, all the way onto that chamfer, that diameter change, and you'd be good. But that's unfortunately not correct. That spacing was somewhere around 5 millimeters. And so as a result of that, it made it really challenging for me to even get a tool in there to pry it back up. But eventually I did, and got it set to the proper diameter, or to the proper distance here, which is, again, somewhere between 10 and 11 millimeters. But always double check it with like a Sharpie test. All right, so one other thing to talk about that was just a little bit concerning, because the way the axle's sitting right now, with it sitting on the wheel studs, all the weight of the hub is sitting and it's resting against that oil deflector. And so right there, it's kind of pushing the seal. Why won't you stay focused there? Anyway, so it's pushing that seal, and almost, getting it into that oil deflector a little bit. And it's designed, it's got a little bit of a lip there. You can kind of see at the bottom, it's got a little bit of a lip that allows it to kind of ride there. But if you don't get it in there when you're pressing it all together, it can actually stay stuck in that oil deflector, and that's, again, not a good thing, like I mentioned. So let me flip this up upside down and show you what's a little disconcerting. But pay attention to that gap between the hub and the axle flange. Okay, so it's going to be a little tricky here, and hopefully I can get a little focus. Little help from focus. Let me use my nose here. Focus right there. Can you do that? Okay, so you can see there's a little bit of a gap there now, and again, it's filled in now with the axle seal because it's seated against that hub surface. But if you don't seat that sill properly, or it doesn't stay seated as you're installing the axle shaft into the hub assembly, that sill can reside totally within that kind of silver oil deflector, and that's an issue. So just pay attention to that, and again, you notice how that gap increased by just a millimeter or two. So the reason that there's a little bit of movement there, I believe, is because the wheel bearing itself isn't a super tight fit against the hub and the surface that you put the wheel bearing into. And so when you get it all put together like this, there's a little bit of play, just that millimeter or two. Once you actually get it installed, all that play goes away, and it's nice and solid. But again, just a little concerning is because everything is not just super tight, but I believe that's how it's supposed to be. Okay, so there's another issue that I came across here on the passenger side axle, and that was actually with this fitting here on the brake line. So this is new, it's replaced. I actually got a whole new line that goes from right here on the outboard side all the way kind of by the differential itself. But the fitting was kind of cross-threaded into the caliper, or into the flexible hose on the caliper. So that necessitated either a new OEM hose. Mine looked pretty old. They weren't cracked, but just something that I should probably take care of. So picked up, probably unnecessarily, but picked up some SLE stainless steel brake lines. So because I've got the rear all torn apart, I'll install the rear hoses. Again, there's 3 on the rear, one on each side, and then obviously a flex line going from the differential to the body. And then I'll leave the fronts for when I do a full brake fluid flush that to do, within the next 6 months to a year or so. So again, just, really minor things, little hiccups. I was able, luckily, and it didn't really matter, but luckily I was able to get that brake line fitting out without breaking it. Used a lot of heat, a lot of PB blaster, and eventually got it. Oh, one other note before I forget. So the rear axle seals. In order to replace these, and I thought, oh, you know, if replacing everything else, I might as well just replace the inner axle seals. Well, the ABS sensors were really, really tight in there. They go in here at the back. You can't see a damn thing. So the ABS sensors, they install here kind of on the back side of the axle, and they were just corroded in there. Not super bad, but you can see, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, kind of rust on that outside edge. Anyway, they took a lot of effort to get out. Anyway, I tried to press in one seal with it still in there, which was stupid. It should have been totally obvious that it was going to be in the way. But anyway, so I mucked up the seal. The ABS sensors have to come out in order to install those inner axle seals, and I tried it first. It's kind of a weird size, so the seal itself sits somewhere at about like 70 millimeters, and all of like the seal driving kits like don't have a 70 millimeter disc. It jumps from like 67, you know, all the way up to like 72. So there's nothing like right in the middle. So I asked on I Hate Mud, had a couple suggestions, ended up going to Home Depot and, you know, picking up a kind of a combination of, you know, 2-inch pipe fittings, and it's kind of the outer diameter of these that work really well, and ended up drilling a hole through it to use the wit's end driver. So I used this for one side, and it worked, you know, really, really well. You know, paid like $8 for it. So I did work with Joey Romero at Wits End to, you know, kind of sketch out and design, you know, a fit for purpose driver, and, you know, hopefully he'll make that available, you know, on his website soon. All right, so the final hiccup was something that I hadn't heard of before, but you know those little tubes of FIPG, the formed in place gasket. You know, there's a 103 that's, you know, the black stuff for, you know, kind of like an oil exposure, like a valve cover gasket. There's a special formulation used for like the, you know, the thermostat housing on the front of these, you know, that's like coolant tolerant. And then there's 1281, which is an orange, you know, it's used for gear oil and transmissions, but transfer cases. So I bought the differential gaskets because I needed them for a template for where to notch out the differential housing, or notch out the housing for the differential. And so I'm like, oh, I'll just use one of those. But I asked around and kind of got convinced to use the 1281, which I had on hand. So, you know, got ready to put everything all back together, and it didn't cure. It didn't set up. It was, you know, it's a tube that was brand new to me, but it was 3 years old. Anyway, so I bought it from a dealer in Illinois, again, just in July of last year. So, you know, there's no reason that it should have been, you know, a 2018 thing. Anyway, it caught them off guard. They asked me to send it back, and they're going to take a look at it. I've talked to the folks that make it. It's 3-bond, and it's got a, you know, 6-month shelf life, allegedly. Anyway, so just, you know, be aware, make sure, you know, to do maybe some testing on it before you, you know, squirt some out onto a paper towel or a piece of cardboard just to make sure it sets up before you use it. Just something to keep in mind. Anyway, so that made me pull the differential off and decided that I'd just go with the cork gasket. And the good news is, because that stuff didn't set up, it cleaned up and wiped up really easily. But anyway, just a little bit of a pain, and something, again, like the brake line that, you know, just kind of gets in the way from you doing things quickly. So besides that, there's a couple things just with the wiring that are worth being aware of. And again, let me reiterate, like I don't know if this is the right way to do this. I'm cheap. Again, I can't buy anything new. I'm kind of wishy-washy on ARB. I don't really want to use the air to drive the locker. So, you know, anyway, you know, the wiring was not too bad. Essentially, you have, you know, depending on what year, and if you're dealing with a 99, there's kind of some rear wiring that hooks into your ABS sensors, and it ties into the driver's side rear corner. So when you have a locker, that same kind of wiring harness also has the diff locker wiring, and so you need to get that. That's real, you know, you don't have to, you need to rewire it however you want, but that was really helpful because then, you know, you just run that piece, and so then you had to get another piece or run your own wires from the driver's side rear to the passenger side rear, and to tie into an existing plug that's there. But the wiring from, you know, that plug here on the passenger side rear all the way up to the, you know, the passenger footwell, that wiring's all in place, so you don't have to do anything. So you just need to get the module, plug it in, and then there's one little other hiccup, is that there is a differential specific, or a locked differential specific instrument panel wiring that goes behind the dash. And I don't know what other people are doing. I didn't see any documentation on it on the forums, but if you want your lights to light up, yeah, you need to either get that, which is going to be a pain because it's actually attached to the bottom of the dash, or like I did, run some additional wires and tie into, some specific pins behind the instrument cluster, and then also run some wiring, to the switch, to the little pins on the switch there. So now if you do that, the one last piece you need is making sure that the little wiring, kind of harness a bunch of connectors that do like the rear vent windows and your power mirrors and the diff locker switch itself, you need to get that as well. So I don't even mean to spend this much detail. These are just wanted to put some some value to some of the nuances and some of the challenges that you have to research in doing the swap. It's not plug and play. It's actually pretty intensive, and you might be better off going with a different solution. What I like about this is that it will look and it'll feel as if it came with a locker from the factory, and that's kind of what I'm going for, as opposed to adding some more aftermarket stuff to the truck. So your mileage may vary. Do what you think is best. This is what, again, is hopefully going to work out for me. I have tested it, so I do have a pretty good feeling that it's all going to work out in the end once I get this thing back on the ground. But anyway, those are some of the tips and tricks that I learned while installing the best locker, in my opinion, for the 100 Series Land Cruiser.